You're sitting in the car outside your own driveway, engine still running, phone face down on your lap, because you just told someone in your family about a decision you made, and now you're waiting. Not for a response exactly. You already got their response, a small pause, a slightly flat, "Oh, okay, nothing dramatic." But you're still sitting there, engine idling, because some part of you hasn't decided yet how you feel about your own choice. It's waiting for something. A second nod. A little more warmth in their voice next time you bring it up. Confirmation that what you did was actually fine. You made the decision days ago. You were sure of it then. So why does it suddenly feel unfinished? Like it's still waiting on someone else's signature before it counts as real. Or maybe it's not a driveway. Maybe it's a group chat and you typed out an honest opinion, deleted it, typed a softer version, deleted that too, and finally sent something so neutral it barely says anything at all, then spent the next 10 minutes watching for the little typing bubble, waiting to see how it landed before you let yourself relax. Maybe it's a job offer you already know you want to take, except you haven't told anyone yet, because some part of you is quietly bracing for a reaction that might complicate how sure you feel. In each version, the pattern is the same. The decision gets made once in your own mind, and then made again and again in the reactions of everyone you imagine might weigh in on it. You didn't build this habit on purpose. Almost no one does. It starts small, usually in childhood, in moments where a parent's face told you whether you'd done something right before you'd even finished doing it, where a teacher's tone told you whether your answer was worth anything before you finished speaking it, where love and attention seemed to arrive on a schedule set entirely by someone else's approval of you. Over enough years, that pattern quietly rewires itself into something bigger than any one relationship. It becomes a general rule your mind runs constantly, mostly out of sight, and action doesn't feel fully real, fully okay, fully yours, until someone else has looked at it and nodded. And once that rule is running, it doesn't just affect big decisions like careers or relationships. It runs underneath everything. What you wear, what you say in a group text, what opinion you're willing to admit you actually hold in a room full of people who might disagree. Think about how much quiet negotiating happens before you even open your mouth in certain rooms. You have a thought during a work meeting, a genuinely good one, but before you say it, some fast internal committee runs a calculation. Will this land well? Will anyone push back? Is this the kind of thing that gets nodded at, or the kind that gets a slightly too long pause afterward? By the time you've run that calculation, the moment to speak has often already passed, and you've said something safer instead, something less yours, something built for approval rather than built for truth. This happens dozens of times a day for most people, so quietly and so quickly that it rarely registers as a pattern at all. It just feels like being careful, being thoughtful, being considerate, but underneath the caution is a quieter transaction. You're trading a piece of your actual voice for the promise of someone else's approval, and you're doing it so often you've stopped noticing the trade is even happening. Add up enough of these small trades, and something strange happens over the years. You can end up with a life that looks, from the outside, entirely like a series of your own choices. Your job, your home, your habits, your opinions, while quietly knowing that a fair number of them were shaped less by what you actually wanted and more by what wouldn't invite a raised eyebrow. It's rarely one dramatic moment that builds this pattern. It's 1,000 small ones, each one small enough to seem harmless on its own. The way a single grain of sand means nothing until enough of them accumulate into a shape you no longer recognize as something you built freely. Consider how differently a simple choice can unfold depending on which version of you is making it. You're deciding whether to leave a stable but unfulfilling job for something riskier that actually excites you. The version of you running on approval will quietly poll an imagined jury before deciding anything, picturing a parent's concerned face, a friend's raised eyebrow, a coworker's unspoken judgment, weighing the decision less against your own sense of what you want and more against how defensible it would sound if you had to explain it to each of them individually. The version of you running on your own judgment still consults people you trust, still weighs real risk honestly, but the deciding vote belongs to you, not to an imagined committee whose opinions you've never actually confirmed and, in many cases, never will. What makes this especially strange, once you notice it, is how much of that imagined jury never actually shows up to deliver a verdict at all. You picture the concerned face, brace for the raised eyebrow, rehearse a defense for the coworker's unspoken judgment, and then, days or weeks later, you finally mention the decision out loud, and the reaction is almost always smaller and less dramatic than anything you rehearsed. Most people, it turns out, are far too occupied running their own version of this same internal courtroom to spend much real time presiding over yours. The jury you were so carefully managing was mostly a jury of one, built entirely out of your own imagination, wearing other people's faces. Here's the idea this entire way of living rests on, and once you actually see it clearly, you can't quite unsee it. The moment you decide that someone else's opinion has the power to grant or deny your sense of being okay, you've handed over something that was never really theirs to hold in the first place. Their approval was never a currency you were required to collect before living your own life. It only started to feel that way because somewhere along the line you agreed to the terms without ever consciously signing anything. Freedom, real freedom, the kind the old philosophers actually meant when they used the word, begins the moment your sense of being okay stops requiring a second signature from anyone else. This is different from indifference, and worth separating clearly from it right at the start. Indifference says nothing anyone thinks matters at all, a stance that usually curdles into isolation or a kind of brittle defensiveness against anything resembling feedback. What's being described here is something else entirely. Full engagement with other people, full willingness to hear them, care about them, be moved by them, while no longer requiring their nod before you're allowed to trust your own read on your own life. The goal isn't to stop the opinions from arriving. Opinions will always arrive, constantly, from every direction. The goal is to stop treating each one as a ballot that has to be counted before you're permitted to feel settled. Diogenes of Sinope lived this out about as dramatically as anyone in recorded history, sleeping in a large ceramic jar in the middle of Athens, owning almost nothing, deliberately ignoring the customs and opinions that governed everyone around him, not out of hostility, but out of a genuine conviction that a person's peace shouldn't depend on what a crowd thought of him. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world at the time, came to visit him and asked what he could do for him, Diogenes reportedly asked him only to step aside, because he was blocking the sunlight. It's a strange, almost comic image, but underneath it sits something serious. A man who had so thoroughly stopped needing approval from anyone, even the most powerful person alive, that not even an emperor's attention could move him off his own ground. It's worth being honest that almost no one is built to live quite that extremely, and the goal here was never to convince you to give away your possessions and sleep outdoors. What matters isn't the jar, it's the underlying posture. The sense that your peace doesn't rise or fall based on who happens to be standing in front of you at any given moment, whether that's an emperor or a coworker or a parent whose approval you've been quietly chasing for decades. Diogenes simply took the principle to its furthest possible edge, useful less as a literal instruction and more as a marker of just how far the practice can be taken by someone who commits to it fully. Epictetus gave this same idea a more workable shape for people who weren't planning to live in a jar. He taught that other people's opinions of you fall entirely outside your control, in the same category as the weather or the actions of strangers, and that spending your energy trying to manage something that was never yours to manage is a guaranteed way to stay anxious for the rest of your life. What is yours, he said, is your own judgment, your own effort, your own choices. Confuse the two, spend your life trying to steer something that was never steerable, and you'll always feel slightly out of control, always waiting on a verdict that was never actually coming. Because other people's opinions shift with their mood, their day, their own unresolved history, none of which has anything to do with you. Seneca, writing letters of advice to a friend later in his life, warned specifically against what he called living according to opinion rather than according to nature, pointing out how exhausting it becomes to constantly measure your choices against what a crowd might think, rather than against what's actually true or actually good. He observed that the person who arranges their whole life around avoiding disapproval ends up owned by everyone whose disapproval they fear. A strange kind of slavery dressed up as good manners. He wasn't arguing for rudeness or indifference to others. He was arguing that a life built around dodging judgment is never really your own life at all. It's a life built entirely out of other people's imagined verdicts, verdicts you invented yourself and then spent years trying to satisfy. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately to himself while ruling an empire that constantly demanded his image be managed for public consumption, noted how strange it is that we worry endlessly about the opinions of people we don't even respect, people whose judgment we wouldn't seek out on any other matter, and yet we hand them a vote on our own peace anyway, simply out of habit. He suggested imagining how few of the people whose opinions you fret over you'd actually choose as advisors if the choice were entirely yours, stripped of any social pressure to care what they thought. For most people, the honest answer narrows that imagined jury down considerably, from a crowd to a small handful of voices actually worth listening to, which makes the whole exercise of managing everyone's impression suddenly look far less necessary than it felt a moment earlier. A related teaching runs through much of Buddhist thought as well, centered on the idea of non-attachment, not to people or experiences themselves, but to the outcomes we insist on controlling, including how we're perceived. The teaching isn't that opinions don't matter or that connection with others should be avoided. It's that suffering multiplies the moment we grip tightly to a specific outcome we can't actually control, and someone else's approval is about as uncontrollable an outcome as exists, shaped by their mood, their history, their own unresolved struggles, none of which you can reach from where you're standing. Loosening the grip doesn't mean caring less about the people in your life. It means no longer staking your peace on a result that was never fully yours to secure in the first place, freeing you to show up honestly instead of strategically. There's a reason this particular struggle runs so deep, and modern psychology gives it a fairly precise name: The psychologist Carl Rogers, one of the most influential figures in the study of human development, described something he called conditions of worth. The idea that many people grow up learning, often without anyone meaning to teach it, that love and acceptance only arrive under certain conditions. Be quiet enough, achieve enough, agree enough, and warmth follows. Fall short of those conditions, and warmth quietly withdraws. A child raised under enough of these conditions doesn't consciously decide to become approval seeking as an adult. It happens automatically, because the nervous system learned early that safety itself was tied to meeting someone else's standard, and that lesson doesn't politely retire once childhood ends. It keeps running in the background for decades, applied now to bosses, partners, friends, and strangers online, all standing in, without any of them realizing it, for the original audience whose approval once meant survival. This is part of why a single dismissive comment from a near stranger can sometimes hit harder than it logically should. It's rarely really about that person at all. Their reaction simply happened to land on a nerve that was wired decades earlier, by someone whose opinion once genuinely determined whether you felt safe in your own home. The stranger becomes, for a brief moment, a stand-in for that original figure, and your nervous system responds accordingly, out of proportion to what the actual moment calls for. Recognizing this substitution doesn't make the sting disappear instantly, but it does something almost as useful. It tells you where to aim your attention, not at the stranger, and not even really at the comment, but at the old pattern quietly doing the driving underneath it. Rogers believed the way out wasn't to stop caring about people entirely, but to slowly build what he called unconditional positive regard for yourself. A baseline sense of being okay that doesn't rise and fall with each interaction. That's easy to say and considerably harder to build, especially after years of the opposite pattern running quietly in the background. But naming the mechanism is itself useful, because once you can see that your need for approval isn't really about the current person in front of you, it's an old survival strategy, misapplied to a present that no longer requires it, the whole dynamic starts to loosen its grip, even before you've fully changed anything about how you act. So here's a practice for the exact moment it's happening, the moment right before you're about to shape a decision, an opinion, or a choice around someone else's expected reaction. Pause and ask yourself one honest question. Would I still feel good about this if no one else ever found out? Not because secrecy is the goal, but because the question strips away the approval-seeking layer and leaves you looking directly at what you actually think, apart from what you expect to be told about it. If the answer is yes, you still feel good about it even in total privacy. That's usually a sign you're standing on solid ground of your own making. If the answer is no, if the whole appeal collapses the moment no one's watching, that's worth noticing too, not as a verdict on you, but as useful information about which version of the choice was actually yours. Try this with something small before applying it somewhere bigger. Say you're deciding whether to speak up in a group chat about a plan you actually disagree with. Before typing anything, run the question, would I still hold this opinion if this group never saw it, if there were no reactions to manage, no risk of anyone thinking less of me? If the answer is yes, that's worth saying, even carefully, even kindly, because it's actually yours. If you notice the opinion only exists because you think it'll play well, that's worth noticing too, not as something shameful, just as data about how much of what you say gets built for approval rather than built for truth. Or apply it to a bigger decision, the kind that actually has weight to it. Say you're weighing whether to end a friendship that's quietly been draining you for years, one that everyone else in your circle seems to think highly of. The approval-seeking version of the question asks how it would look to end it, who might take sides, whose opinion of you might shift. The honest version of the question strips all of that away and asks only whether you'd still want distance from this friendship if no one else's reaction were part of the calculation at all. That question doesn't make the decision easy. It just makes it yours again, clearing away the layer of imagined audience reaction that had been quietly steering the outcome before you'd even consciously chosen anything. For the deeper, recurring version of this pattern, a longer exercise works better than a single pause in the moment. Take 15 minutes at the end of a week and write down every decision, small or large, where you can honestly recall shaping your behavior around someone else's expected reaction. The outfit you didn't wear because of a comment someone once made. The honest answer you softened because you didn't want to see someone's face fall. The hobby you quietly dropped because it never quite landed with people whose opinion mattered to you. Next to each one, write down what you actually wanted underneath the approval-seeking layer, stripped of any consideration for how it would be received. Reading the two columns side by side usually produces a quiet, sometimes uncomfortable clarity. How much of an ordinary week gets spent managing an audience that, in most cases, was barely paying attention in the first place. Keep this list somewhere you'll actually see it again, and repeat the exercise once a month rather than once and never again. The real value shows up on the second or third pass, when you start noticing repeat entries, the same handful of people or situations showing up again and again as the audience your choices keep quietly performing for. once you can name them specifically. Rather than feeling approval seeking as a vague, formless pressure, the pattern becomes something you can actually work with, a short, specific list of relationships worth examining more honestly, rather than an overwhelming sense that the whole world is somehow watching and judging every move you make. Turn the evening version of this into something small and repeatable, not a demanding ritual. Just 5 or 10 honest minutes before sleep done in the same quiet spot each night so it becomes something your mind starts to expect rather than resist. It doesn't need candles or journals or any particular setup, just a few minutes of stillness before the day officially ends. Ask yourself where today you shaped a choice around someone else's expected approval, rather than around what you actually believed. Ask where you stayed quiet not because you had nothing to say but because you were managing how you'd be received. Ask what you might have said, worn, chosen, or done differently today if no one's opinion had been part of the equation at all. And ask, gently, without judgment, what it would take to trust your own read on a situation even before anyone else weighs in on it. These questions won't produce a tidy answer most nights, and they don't need to. Their value is in the noticing, repeated often enough that the noticing eventually starts happening in real time, in the actual moment, rather than only in hindsight at the end of the day. Underneath all of this sits a root cause worth looking at directly, even though it's uncomfortable. Needing approval isn't really about the specific person whose opinion you're currently chasing. It's about an old, learned association between being approved of and being safe, formed in an environment, usually early in life, where safety genuinely did depend on someone else's mood or judgment. The adult version of you no longer lives in that environment. You're not actually in danger if a coworker frowns at your idea, or if a friend disagrees with a decision you've made, or if a stranger online dislikes an opinion you hold. But the old wiring doesn't automatically know that the danger has passed, and it keeps sounding the same alarm it learned to sound decades ago, applied now to situations that carry none of the original stakes. This is worth being gentle with yourself about, because the pattern made complete sense given where it came from. A child who learns that approval determines safety isn't being irrational, they're adapting correctly to the environment they were actually in. The problem only shows up later, when the environment has changed but the adaptation hasn't been updated to match it, the way a smoke alarm calibrated for a small kitchen keeps going off in a house 3 times the size, not because anything is currently burning, but because it was never recalibrated for the space it now occupies. Recalibrating doesn't happen through willpower alone, it happens slowly, through repeated moments of proving to your own nervous system, in small low-stakes situations, that disapproval doesn't actually end in danger anymore, that you can survive someone's frown, someone's disagreement, someone's flat tone, and still be entirely fine 10 minutes later. A useful place to start is somewhere genuinely low stakes, not the relationship carrying the most weight, but something smaller, like voicing a mild preference to a barista, or admitting to a coworker you haven't seen a show everyone's talking about instead of quietly nodding along. Each time you survive a small moment of mild disapproval or simple difference without it costing you anything real, you're feeding your nervous system new evidence, slowly overriding the old alarm with updated information about what today's world actually requires of you. There's a misconception worth clearing up before going any further, because people often hear, "stop needing approval," and quietly translate it into, "stop caring what anyone thinks ever, about anything." That's not what this is, and the difference matters. There's a real and important distinction between craving approval and valuing honest feedback. A person who has actually done this work isn't dismissive or arrogant, brushing off every piece of input as beneath them. They can still listen carefully to someone who genuinely knows more than they do, still adjust their thinking when presented with a good argument, still care deeply about the people in their life and how their choices affect them. What's different is the underlying need. Feedback for this person is information to be weighed. It's no longer oxygen they can't function without. They can hear, "I don't agree with that," and simply consider it, rather than spiraling, rather than needing it resolved into agreement before they can feel steady again. Picture 2 people receiving the exact same critique on a project they've worked hard on. The first hears it and immediately feels the ground shift, spending the next hour mentally arguing their case, seeking out someone else who might validate them instead, quietly resenting the person who offered the critique in the first place. The second hears the same words, feels a brief sting because caring about the work is natural, but doesn't confuse the critique with a verdict on their worth. They ask a clarifying question if the feedback seems useful, set it aside if it doesn't, and move on with their afternoon largely intact. Neither person cares less about the outcome. The difference is entirely in what the feedback is allowed to determine. One hands over their entire sense of okay-ness to it. The other treats it as one input among many, weighed and then released. None of this work happens only in the mind, and the body carries its own version of approval, seeking whether you consciously notice it or not. A tightness across the shoulders while waiting for someone's reaction, a held breath right before hitting send on something honest, a stomach that won't settle until a text gets a reply. Two small physical habits can help here. The first is noticing the exact moment your breath shortens while waiting on someone's response, and deliberately slowing it down, in through the nose for 4 counts, out through the mouth for 6, 3 or 4 rounds, done specifically in that waiting window rather than after the anxiety has already built. The second is a short walk taken immediately after any interaction that left you anxiously replaying how you were received, using the steady rhythm of movement to interrupt the mental loop before it has time to fully take hold, giving your body a chance to settle before your mind starts constructing an entire narrative out of a single flat tone or delayed reply. Both of these habits work for the same underlying reason. Approval seeking isn't purely a thinking problem. It's a nervous system pattern that activates faster than conscious thought can intervene. By the time you're aware you're anxiously waiting for someone's reaction, your body has often already tightened, your breath has already shortened, your attention has already narrowed onto whatever signal might tell you how you're being received. Trying to reason your way out of that state with logic alone rarely works well, because the body isn't listening to logic in that moment, it's listening to sensation. Slowing the breath and moving the body speak that same sensory language, giving your nervous system direct evidence that the moment is survivable, evidence that lands faster and more convincingly than any thought ever could on its own. Bring it together slowly, the way anything durable actually gets built. First, recognize that the need for approval you carry today was almost certainly built somewhere else, in an earlier chapter of your life where it genuinely served a purpose, even if it no longer does. Then, remember that other people's opinions were never actually yours to control, no matter how much energy you've spent trying to manage them. And that energy can be redirected toward the only thing that was ever actually within your reach: your own judgment, your own effort, your own honest read on your own life. Next, practice the pause, the honest question, the weekly review, not as one-time fixes but as habits you return to until the noticing becomes automatic rather than effortful. Finally, hold the distinction between valuing real feedback and craving approval, because the goal was never to stop caring about people, only to stop requiring their verdict before you're allowed to feel steady in your own choices. This won't resolve in a single evening, and it would be dishonest to promise it does. There will still be moments, maybe for years, where you catch yourself softening an honest opinion, or waiting a beat too long for someone's reaction before deciding how you feel about your own choice. That's not a sign the work isn't taking. It's simply a sign of how long the original pattern had to build itself before you ever noticed it. What changes with practice isn't that the old pull disappears completely. What changes is how quickly you notice it happening, how much sooner you catch yourself reaching for someone else's verdict, and how much more readily you can hand that verdict back to yourself once you do notice. Back in that driveway, engine still idling, phone still face down, notice what's actually happening. You're not waiting for information. You already know how you feel about the decision you made. You're waiting for a second signature on something that was already fully yours the moment you decided it. Turn the engine off, walk inside. Let the decision stay exactly as settled as it already was before you needed anyone else to confirm it. And if it's the group chat instead, the message already sent, the typing bubble still flickering somewhere on someone else's screen, notice that too. Whatever comes back, warm or cool, enthusiastic or brief, it was never actually going to be the thing that made your original thought true or worthwhile. It was already true the moment you thought it clearly enough to type it. Put the phone down before the reply comes. Let the moment stay complete without it. You were never actually waiting for their approval. You were waiting for permission you'd secretly been withholding from yourself. If this reached you at the right moment, there's another video close by that goes further into this same quiet work, the kind that doesn't resolve in a single evening but slowly changes how steady an ordinary day starts to feel. Take whatever was useful here, leave the rest without guilt, and carry a little more of your own ground back into tomorrow. There's no single day where this work finishes, no final evening where the old habit disappears for good and never returns. But there is a noticeable shift, usually somewhere in the middle of the practice, rather than at some dramatic finish line, where checking in with yourself starts to feel more natural than checking in with everyone else first. That shift is worth waiting for, and worth building toward one honest evening at a time. Not because the world will stop offering opinions, but because you'll finally stop needing its permission to trust the one you already have.